Boys and girls, before we get started, we got something we have to tell you about because we're all at home, we're all trying to find stuff to watch, and there is a fantastic streaming service that you might not know about, but you need to know about, especially if you're a genuine love of cinema. And I know you are here with our being a listener in the seats with. It's about the service called Film Movement Plus. It's a fantastic streaming service that has a really diverse and eclectic selection of films all across the world, from documentaries to foreign cinema to some old classics to some modern ones and a little bit of everything else in between. And if you take a look there this month, they've recently added some great stuff like Shake the Dust, which is a documentary from a few years back, which takes a look at the cultural impact of hip hop and breakdancing in various cultures all across the world, and it's a wonderful film, and I can't recommend it enough. And there's other stuff like Karl Marx City, which dives into sort of the history of the German Democratic Republic, and sort of it allows the filmmaker to sort of trace her past and sort of give us facts, but in a very sort of artistic and fictionalized way. But there's stuff like Pretty to Durango from filmmaker Alex de la Iglesias, which just got added as well. Which is a wild film with Rosie Perez and Javier Bardem from back in the day. But it's one of those things where there's just all this stuff that you really do need to check out. And you know what? It's a scant $5.99 a month, and I mean, no one's really going to Starbucks anymore, so it's basically the price of a coffee. And because you are a loyal listener to us here at In the Seats with, not only if you sign up at Film Movement Plus, which is at filmmovementplus.com, you get a free month, but if you use our special promo code, which is SEATS, you get an extra 3 months at half off. That is a steal for all sorts of fantastic cinema. If you want to do that, please go visit them over at filmmovementplus.com, and remember to sign up with the promo code SEATS to get the special deal, and enjoy getting lost in a world of truly fantastic cinema, which we enjoy every day, and we hope you do too.
Ladies and gentlemen, please take your seats.
In life, not only do you have to pay attention to the social stakes, but the professional ones as well. And if you're within the sound of my voice, that must mean you're in the seats with once more. As always, my name is Dave Voigt, and I'm the host of this podcast, where we sit down with a wide-ranging variety of industry professionals and pick their brain about current projects, state of the industry, how they got started, and so very much more in a light and conversational fashion. And if you like how we do things, around here, I'm assuming you do, we'd really love it if you'd subscribe to the podcast. You can find us over at Apple, Spotify, Amazon, Google, basically wherever you get your podcasts. And plus, we archive every single one of our episodes over at our YouTube channel, and if you could subscribe to us there too and give us a like, we would really appreciate it. Also, you can find us on social media. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at either In the Seats, or at It's Podcast One for all sorts of updates. And finally, and I do dare say most importantly, please pay us a visit over at intheseats.ca for all the latest and greatest from the world of film, television, basically the moving image at large, as we cover festivals in and around Toronto and all across the world. And we love writing about that kind of thing, and we love it when you come read about it. So please come on by. I know the team will appreciate it. On this episode, we got an interesting one. We're jumping into The Sound of Identity, which is a real fascinating documentary which is hitting most VOD platforms tomorrow, thanks to our friends over at Shout Studios, and it's from director James Kicklighter, and it's basically the story of the first transgender woman, whose name is Lucia Lucas, to perform as Don Giovanni in a professional opera. And she's making her historic debut, especially considering that's her North American debut, in one of the reddest states in the United States. And it shows sort of the politics around it, and it shows just sort of not just the social issues that would be that are circle around having a transgender singer sort of starring in an opera, but also the fact that it's happening in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which I didn't know it was an opera town, but as you watch this film, you'll learn a lot more about opera because apparently it's a big opera town. And we sat down with director James Kicklighter to just talk about all these different issues that swirl in and around the story and how he managed to make something really kind of big and, I guess, operatic, as it were, without knowing all that much about opera. But it's one of those things that we really get interested in the subject and we get sort of transposed past the issues around opera as it were, and it really comes down to one of those really interesting films, which is about a person, and as people, we inherently love to learn about other people, and that's sort of the nature of storytelling. And it's really an excellent film. I do recommend you check it out on iTunes. It'll be on iTunes, Apple TV, all those sort of things on Tuesday, June 1st for rent or purchase, I would imagine. But first, I hope you enjoy our talk with James because it was a real good one, and it's a real interesting film that I hope you check out. No, I mean, I guess the first question is just, I mean, obviously, congratulations on the film, but I mean, walk me through, I guess, having the story come across your desk.
Sure. Well, the producers I had met in Tulsa 2 years before I was filming this. There was an event called Tulsa Tomorrow that was put on where they flew in 50 young professionals from all over the country that were, successful in different industries. And I met them in Tulsa, and 2 years later, they thought of me for this film and they said, "Hey, we've got the rights to do this movie about the first transgender opera singer to ever have a leading role on the operatic stage. What do you think?" And I say, "I think that's fascinating, but I know nothing about opera. So I think you've called the wrong guy." And they called me again and they called me again. They said, "Why don't you talk to Lucia, the subject of the film, and see what you think?" And as soon as I talked to her, I knew I had to do the film and get past that barrier.
Was Lucia sort of on board for this? Because I mean, again, sort of there's positive subject matter in it, but there's also some difficult stuff at the same time. Like, how on board was she to just sort of have someone with a camera
Right.
in her face basically 24/7?
That's the challenge, isn't it? Well, of course, we talked about that walking into it because there's a couple of parameters you have to figure
Yeah.
out directorially, right? First of all, I'm kind of a guest in somebody else's house.
Right.
They are doing a real show. And so I had to establish with the director of the show, the opera company, and Lucia to say, I want to be a wallflower here. I don't want to be bothering your process because I understand you have a show to do. Lucia had to be okay with us following her in her downtime and also off days, scheduling extra work. So we did have to set some of those parameters for filming, but ultimately, I think those kind of creative constraints actually help you as a filmmaker.
Now, did you stay sort of as, I guess, blind as possible to opera, or did you end up doing any kind of research as you sort of started getting more and more into the project?
Well, I was very fortunate that at the Tulsa Opera, they happened to have some of the greatest people working in modern opera, which I certainly didn't know walking into that. But with Tobias Picker, who's the artistic director, he's a legendary composer in his own right. Denny Sayers, who is the director of the show, she's from London and has worked all over the world doing different shows, in addition to the rest of the cast. And so I did do some research, but the nice thing about this project was, despite the fact it being in Tulsa, you had this global cast, not just Lucia from Germany, that really enabled me to be a fairly quick study, because when you have that kind of talent, it's really hard not to learn something from them.
Now, it sounds like Tulsa is an opera town. I mean, it almost feels like there's a film in just sort of exploring why Tulsa is an opera town, because I don't necessarily equate the two.
Right. Because I didn't know that either, right? Walking into it, as I said, I knew very little about opera. And, Tulsa has remarkable arts organizations. They have the ballet, they have the opera, they have the symphony, they have all of these things because the founders of the city in the 1900s decided to endow these organizations so they would have these things, oil money, right? And so that's why the city of Tulsa has such a remarkable arts legacy and why they have organizations that are so renowned. I think that we don't think about places like Tulsa having things like that because we always think about the Met or places in San Francisco, Los Angeles, et cetera. But there are many remarkable organizations like Tulsa Opera all over the country.
No, I mean, I think what I really appreciated about the film, and I mean, especially as you were following Lucia, she wasn't trying to sort of be sort of this champion for social justice via talks or this, that, or the other. She's trying to do it through the work. And I'm kind of curious, like, as you were sort of following everyone along on this process, everyone was so dedicated to the work that that really kind of struck me. Like, is there anything that you sort of pulled away from sort of the experience of assembling this world-class opera?
Yeah, I think the fascinating thing for me as a director to observe someone's artistic process, it's very rare because as a creative, you're usually in your own box, right? You work with
Yeah.
yourself. As a director, you specifically work with yourself, which is a strange thing because if you're an actor or if you're a producer, if you're a writer, you're going to work with a variety of different talents. But as a director, if you're kind of steering the ship, the only things you observe is when you go visit someone else's set or see how someone else works because it's such an interior process. And for me, being able to observe Denny Sayers, for example, I was just blown away with her techniques as a stage director, as someone who understands choreography and movement and motion in such specific ways. I felt like I was getting a special master's class that I didn't pay for. It was really remarkable.
Or did you always know the framework of the film would be at least more centered around sort of the work and the mounting thereof rather than the sort of, I don't, and calling it a gimmick is a bad word, but just sort of leaning on the fact that she was the first trans person to be in an opera in North America?
Well, you're right, because to my mind, I told Lucia and the producers this. I felt like if the story was about that, it would in fact be kind of gimmicky.
Yeah.
That would be it's the obvious thing, right? The obvious carrot is the story is about the first transgender opera singer to have a leading role. That's not intrinsically an interesting story to me.
Mm.
And nor is the story of we're putting on a performance. That's a structure. That's not a story. The structure is we have 30 days to get to a performance. The log line is there's the first transgender opera singer in history to have a leading role. The story has to be about something else. It has to be about something personal for Lucia. And in the narrative that we told in digging around, I felt like the narrative I wanted to tell was much more personal about what it means to be an artist, what drives us to be artists. I think that can apply for anyone that's an actor, a writer, director, musician, all the way across the board. And that was something to me that I felt would be a lot more interesting for someone to watch.
For sure. And I mean, something else the film does touch on a little bit, which I found fascinating because, I mean, especially with something like opera, you really do have to pour yourself into the art and pour yourself into the performance. And being a trans person in a red state, that can be a bit difficult. And I mean, I'm kind of curious, like, as you were sort of seeing it all unfold, was there anything that surprised you about the process? Because I mean, again, I'm still kind of wrapping my head around Tulsa as an opera town, even, you know what I mean?
I understand. It took me a minute too. I think that one of the challenging things at the moment in culture in general is that I think that because societies are so polarized at the moment, it's hard to see places like Tulsa as being both things.
Right.
That it can be a town that is probably a little more conservative, but it also can have the first transgender opera singer. We think of, in America at least, states as being red or blue, but that's not really true. There are places like Tulsa or Atlanta or, Austin, Texas. The list goes on and on and on. And I was surprised that there was no protests or pickets or things like that because we were fully expecting that walking into the film. I
Mm.
was really glad that I did not have to tell that story because, again, I go back to what I said earlier. That is not a story that's very interesting to me. That's the
Yeah.
obvious story. That's the thing you're expecting. And for me as a director, the challenge I try to always ask myself is if you read the log line, what is it I can do as a director to surprise you with the plot? And that's one thing that I think a lot of people walking into this film will expect. And I'm really proud and happy that that didn't happen in Tulsa.
Well, and I mean, I think your film really does give us a reality that we've forgotten about because, like you say, we live in such a world right now that is so polarized. It's either black or it's white, or it's right or it's wrong. But the reality is, we all live in such varying shades of gray that things can coexist. And that's just sort of how we get along in life. And I think that's really sort of a beautiful message to put forward. And I'm kind of curious, like, was that something you saw as you were sort of assembling everything, or was it something that maybe you sort of found in post?
I did think of that as we were shooting. One thing that I knew kind of as we were going through the filming process is I knew about 5 or 6 days into filming that I knew what the plot was going to be, start to finish. Then my job was figuring out how to tell that story, right? Can I tell that story? One of the challenges of filming a documentary is that, first of all, the film you think you're going to walk in and make is not usually the film you're going to make. And if you do happen to find it early, like I did in The Sound of Identity, it's trying to figure out if you can tell that story and then tracking those plot lines as they happen in real time, right? And so I knew early on that coexistence in Tulsa was something I wanted to tap into, but I also felt that tapping into that, not only for those reasons we just described, had a lot of import because a story like this is going to have more influence on the people in the surrounding area that are in the LGBTQ community than perhaps it would in New York or Los Angeles or Miami, a major city. It's going to mean more to them because they may not have the same acceptance in this little dot that's in a sea of people that are different than that. And that I felt was really important to highlight for the people there too.
Do you think a lot of those issues played into them mounting Giovanna as well, as opposed to something else? Because there are parallels in the story as well.
Right. And that was another layer that I tried to weave into the film, that I thought of Don Giovanni as a character within the picture itself. And that was something that obviously the opera had decided when they cast Lucia, before they cast Lucia, to say that we're going to do Giovanni because it's a classic opera. And every opera company tends to do a classic opera every season, I have learned. So that was one that they chose to do. When they added Lucia to the cast, it adds a lot of dimension to it. Because obviously that integrates some really fascinating cultural conversations about toxic masculinity and what that means by casting a trans woman. That negotiation between voice and gender and identity was just such a intriguing triangulation. And, with the film, I felt it was really important to tap into that.
Has Lucia seen the final product?
Oh, yes. And she liked it, fortunately. So she gave a really nice interview today in New Now Next where she said nice things. So I'm very glad that she liked it. That's the challenge of making a film, not just about a real person, but also about someone that's kind of on the cusp of success. You have a lot of responsibility as a director because I could easily make something that's damaging to her career. And so I tried to find something that was honest to who she was, to what happened during those 30 days, but also being mindful of this is something that's going to have a big influence on her career. In the world of opera, it's extremely rare to have a film. Maybe, I don't know if there is one. If there is, someone tell me, but I don't think there are many, if any, films that have a artist on the cusp of success in opera. It's usually when they're dead, they're almost dead, or they're dying. It's always at the end of their life, not at the beginning of what will be a successful career for Lucia.
Well, and I mean, I think that's another thing about the film that I really appreciated, because it didn't make light of it wasn't trying to just focus on sort of the social ramifications of, her having this first leading role, but professionally, this is a big deal for her as well. And it struck such the right balance of sort of acknowledging the social issues, but acknowledging the fact that her career is basically on the line here.
Right. And that to me was a much higher stake than her being trans.
Right. Exactly.
I thought that was way more interesting because one thing that I thought a lot about walking into, one, you're asking earlier, what were things I knew? I knew this story would not be a transition story. Yeah. I told Lucia that on day one. I said, I feel like filmmakers are doing a major disservice to the trans community by constantly telling stories that are only about transition. I'm not saying that there are not films out there that are not about transition and trans people, but 9 out of 10 of them are. And I thought that if we could tell a story that was about someone who is beyond that and is now grappling with something else, that actually answered that social question that you just talked about in a much more powerful way, because then we're having a conversation about what it means to exist as opposed to what does it mean to become something else, because that becoming something else is more of a personal journey, not a physical one. And I think that if we continue to almost fetishize that transition process, I don't think you're doing very much to build acceptance amongst people who do not want to accept trans people.
No, and I mean, you're right. At the end of the day, it has to be, stories about people, because people want to know about people, and that's sort of, that's at the end of the goal of, no matter who you are, you want to be accepted as a human being primarily. And that's really sort of I think something that comes across in your film, just in terms of seeing the professional stakes that she has to go through. And I'm kind of curious, because I always like to ask this, like, in watching the film, like, there's obvious structure and there's obviously points that you're going to get to, but it also felt very big and very cinematic at the same time. I'm kind of curious, for you, like, what movies kind of got you into this business? Because I mean, sometimes you can watch documentaries and it'll feel a little static, it'll feel a little boring, but here I did get a real sense of scale. Like, especially sort of terms of really appreciating some of the theaters, or sort of some of the opera sets, and giving it a bit of flair to it.
Yeah, I wanted it to feel like a narrative film, which I think it does. I mean, obviously it's a documentary, but we shot it. My director of photography and I go way back. We went to college together. We married each other our first week of freshman year. We were roommates for years, and we've worked together now for 15 years. So we have a really close personal and professional working relationship. And when we first, were engaged to do this film, that was one of those early conversations to say the world of opera is really heightened. It's cinematic, and we would do a major disservice to that world if we didn't treat this in the same way. And so we decided to shoot it like a narrative film. We composed every shot. We were very specific about every interview location. With Lucia, for example, it starts on a smaller stage, moves to a medium-sized stage, and then finishes on the large stage. That required me to structure the interviews in an extraordinarily specific way, and in hindsight, kind of risky way. I give the producers a lot of credit for doing that, because if that didn't work, structurally, it wouldn't have worked. I can't go back to a previous stage, just like you can't go to a previous stage in your life. And so I had to be really specific about how that was structured and understand how to do that. And so with the secondary characters, we did the same thing. I kind of observed them and said, what is a setting that is like this character, that is puts them in a place that feels like this person. And so with all those kind of specific choices, we tried to craft a film that felt much more narrative, and I think we pulled it off. I'm really happy about that.
No, I'm curious, because, and I mean, and this goes to general public misconception that documentary is a bit of a static, a bit of a stage form, but really, especially in like the past 10 years, we've seen filmmakers push against those forms and really sort of show how much freedom the documentary form has in sort of inside its shell. And I'm kind of curious, from your perspective, what is it about documentary film that allows for so much freedom? Because you can take a documentary film and let it play like a narrative, but you can't take a narrative film and let it play like a documentary. It doesn't
very hard unless you're doing a documentary, right?
Yeah.
I go between making narrative films and documentary films. I do both. I do advertising as well. And so I think that for me, because I had that kind of mixed skill set, I've done the traditional talking heads documentary. And I felt with this film, like I said, that we had the opportunity to do something different. And so for me, the question always is, in addition to, how do we subvert the audience's expectation of the log line, is how do you best serve the story? And to my mind, the best way to serve this story was to meet the world of opera where I felt my perception of it was, because I thought that would maybe change a viewer's perception of it. Because I think we think of opera as being a dead medium, right? We don't think about it as something that's living or breathing. At least I didn't think about that walking into the film. As I said, knew very little about it. And so while making this, I was trying to say, what can we do to make opera feel exciting, fresh, and have stakes? And to me, that was the only answer.
Now, I'm kind of curious. This is a silly question, but I always like to ask it.
No silly questions.
All right. Well, I have one silly question. Think back in your life. Is there like a moment, or maybe a movie or a piece of work, that was sort of the light bulb, where the light bulb went off in your head and I want to do this, I want to be a filmmaker?
Sure. And you asked that question a minute ago and I realized it. Yeah, Network, Sidney Lumet is the answer to that question.
Love it. Yeah.
In fact, I don't know if you can see, but right here in my office. I have
Oh, fantastic.
which is, I think, the Bible for filmmaking. If any of you want to make a film, this is what you should read
Making
first.
movies, Sidney Lumet, absolutely.
It's a masterpiece of writing. And in fact, I actually have a little homage to Network in my film. The CEO of the Tulsa Opera is framed in the exact same
I
way.
spotted that.
Uh-huh. And so that's a little Easter egg for you film buffs out there. But I did that on purpose because I thought about Network and the end of that scene, when he's talking about the gospel of money, and I felt that would be appropriate framing. So one of my production assistants ran out to get those lights when we saw that table, when we framed it in that way. Again, putting the characters in the setting that makes sense. But that was my homage to Network. I'm really pleased that we pulled that off.
Well, you know what, man? Thanks for the time today, because I think this is a really fascinating film that really just lets us know Lucia and lets us know these sort of professional stakes that, she's under, but also understand sort of what it meant for her to be a trans, artist in the opera world, and also, changing my perceptions on Tulsa, because I didn't know anything about Tulsa, and now that I know it's an opera town, I think that's amazing.
I grew up in South Georgia and live in Los Angeles, so I didn't know much about that part of the world. It's really a remarkable place. Go take a visit, take a trip to Tulsa. It's a cool town.
No, and it's a reminder to sort of not judge the book by the cover, and just sort of understand sort of the shades of gray that we all live in and how important they are. And I think your film does that, and it's a fantastic film, and it's a very entertaining film as well, even if you don't know a thing about opera. I absolutely loved it, and just thank you again for the time today, man. This was fun.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
And don't forget to visit our friends over at Bay Street Video for all your DVD, Blu-ray rental, or purchasing needs this summer, as they are still open for curbside and some mailing delivery as well. Over at 1172 Bay Street, Toronto, Ontario, Canada, you can give them a call at 416-964-9088. That's 416-964-9088. Or send them an email at baystreetvideoto@gmail.com for any of your DVD and Blu-ray needs.